My mother slapped me in front of 300 guests on the happiest day of my life, and the woman who caused it had been dead for 11 years. That's what the whole town believed, anyway. My name is Marin Callahan, and before I tell you what happened in that courtroom, before I tell you how a ghost walked in wearing a gray suit and changed everything I thought I knew about my family, I need to take you back. Back to the morning of my wedding, when I still believed my mother loved me the way mothers are supposed to. I was 28 years old, standing in front of a mirror in the back room of St. Agnes Church, and my hands would not stop shaking. Not from nerves about marrying Daniel, I had never been surer of anything. It was something else. Something I couldn't name yet, a kind of static in the air that morning, like the world was holding its breath. My mother, Ruth, had been quiet all week. Too quiet. She was a woman who filled silence the way other people filled a room with furniture, with opinions, with corrections, with the particular brand of love that always came wrapped in criticism. Your dress is too simple, Marin. Your hair needs more volume. Are you sure about him? That was Ruth. Sharp edges dressed up as concern. But that week, she'd said almost nothing at all. I remember my sister Dana zipping up the back of my dress, her fingers pausing halfway. "You okay?" she whispered. "I'm fine," I said, and I believed it. God, I believed it. I didn't know yet that my mother had spent that entire week making phone calls in the garden, her voice dropping to something cold and clipped whenever anyone walked too close. I didn't know she'd driven 40 minutes out of town twice, telling my father she was handling wedding errands. I didn't know that 3 days before I put on my grandmother's veil, my mother had gone to a lawyer's office and signed her name to a document she swore she would never speak of. All I knew was that my mother's eyes, when she looked at me in that mirror, held something I had never seen in them before. Grief, or maybe it was guilt. At the time, I couldn't tell the difference. The ceremony itself was beautiful. I won't pretend otherwise, because that's the cruelty of it, isn't it? The best day and the worst day, stitched together with the same thread. Daniel cried when he saw me walk down the aisle. My father cried. Even my Aunt Corrine, who cried at grocery store commercials, cried harder than usual. My mother did not cry. She sat in the front pew with her spine straight as a fence post, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white, and she watched me marry the man I loved like she was watching something be buried. I thought maybe it was just her way. Ruth Callahan had never been a woman who wore her heart where people could see it. I told myself that during the vows, during the kiss, during the walk back up the aisle with Daniel's hand warm and solid in mine. I told myself that all through the applause, the rice, the sunlight. I was still telling myself that when we got to the reception hall, when the band started, when my father stood to give his toast with a voice that cracked on the word daughter. And then my mother stood up too. Nobody expected her to speak. That wasn't the plan. But she rose from her seat at the head table with a glass of champagne in her hand that she hadn't touched all night, and the room went quiet the way rooms do when they sense something is about to break. "I have something to say," she announced. Her voice didn't shake. That's the part I remember most, how steady she sounded, like she'd rehearsed it in the mirror the way I'd rehearsed my vows. Daniel's hand found mine under the table. I remember squeezing it. I remember thinking, please, not today, whatever this is. 11 years ago, my mother said, this family buried someone who should have stayed buried. A ripple went through the guests. My father's face went the color of old paper. Dana, 3 tables away, stood halfway up from her chair like she meant to stop what was coming, and then sat back down, frozen. "Mom," I started. "You don't know what you did, Marin," she said, and now her voice did break just slightly, just enough for me to hear the years underneath it. "You don't know who you invited into this family today." I didn't understand. I swear to you, I didn't understand a single word of it. I looked at Daniel, and his face had gone pale in a way I'd never seen, his jaw tight, his eyes darting toward his own parents at the next table over, toward his mother, specifically, who was staring down at the tablecloth like she wished it would swallow her whole. "What are you talking about?" I said, standing now too, my voice rising over the silence of 300 people holding their breath. My mother crossed the room in 6 steps. I remember counting them without meaning to. The way your mind grabs onto small, useless details when something enormous is about to happen. 6 steps in her mother of the bride heels, past the wedding cake, past the guest book table, until she was standing close enough that I could smell her perfume, the same perfume she'd worn my whole childhood. And then she slapped me. Hard enough that the sound of it cracked through the microphone still clipped to my dress. Hard enough that Daniel was out of his chair before I'd even registered the sting. Hard enough that my Aunt Corrine screamed. "You should have asked me," my mother said, her hand still raised, her whole body trembling now like something inside her had finally cracked open after 11 years of holding still. "You should have asked me who his mother really was." I stood there with my hand pressed to my cheek, my wedding dress suddenly feeling like a costume, like I'd wandered into someone else's life. Daniel was beside me, gripping my arm, saying my name, but his voice sounded very far away. "Ruth," my father's voice low and warning, "that's enough." "It is not enough," my mother said, and she was crying now, finally, great heaving sobs that didn't match the steel in her eyes. 11 years, Frank. 11 years I kept this from her to protect her, and she goes and marries into the one family. "Stop." My father was standing too now, his hands out like he was trying to physically hold the moment together. "Not here, not like this." But it was too late for not like this. 300 people had already seen it. 300 phones, I would learn later, had already started recording. I turned to Daniel. I needed him to explain, to say something, to tell me my mother had lost her mind, that this was grief or wine or some old grudge that had nothing to do with us. But when I looked at his face, I didn't see confusion. I saw fear. "Daniel," my voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. "What is she talking about?" He opened his mouth, closed it. His mother, Eleanor, a soft-spoken woman who'd always been kind to me, who'd hugged me at every family dinner like I was already her own daughter, had gone completely still in her chair, her wine glass halfway to her lips, forgotten there. "Daniel," I said again. "I don't know," he said, and I believed him. God help me, I believed him because I wanted to. "Marin, I swear, I don't know what she's talking about." My mother laughed then. It wasn't a happy sound. It was the sound of something breaking loose after being held down for over a decade. "Ask your husband's mother," she said, looking past me now, straight at Eleanor. "About the woman she claims died in that car accident 11 years ago. Ask her why there's no grave. Ask her why I saw her alive 3 weeks ago, standing outside a courthouse in Millbrook, wearing a face I have never once forgotten." The room had stopped breathing entirely. "She's dead," Eleanor finally said, her voice cracking down the middle. "She has been dead for 11 years. I buried her myself, Ruth. I stood at that grave." "Then explain," my mother said, "why I am about to be called as a witness in a hearing that names her. Alive, in writing." I felt the floor tilt beneath my white satin shoes. Somewhere behind me, the band had stopped playing without anyone telling them to. Somewhere behind me, my sister Dana was crying into her hands. Somewhere behind me, 300 people were witnessing the unraveling of a secret that had been buried, or so everyone believed, for 11 long years. And somewhere out there, a woman we had all mourned, a woman whose photograph still sat in a frame in my new mother-in-law's living room, was alive. And in less than 3 weeks, she was going to walk into a courtroom and look me directly in the eye and tell me exactly why my wedding day had just become the beginning of the worst month of my life, 3 weeks. That's how long I had to sit with the wreckage of my own wedding before the courtroom doors would give me any answers. 3 weeks of Daniel sleeping on the couch of the apartment we were supposed to be moving into together as newlyweds, both of us too raw, too stunned, to know how to be married when we didn't even know what we were married into. 3 weeks of my mother refusing to say another word, beyond what she'd already said in front of 300 witnesses. "I told you what I know," she said, the one time I drove to her house and stood on her porch, still wearing the bruise of betrayal on my face that no makeup could quite cover. "The rest isn't mine to tell, Marin." "You slapped me at my wedding," I said, my voice cracking. "You owe me more than that." She looked at me then, and for just a second the steel in her eyes wavered. I was trying to protect you, she whispered, the way I couldn't protect myself. She wouldn't explain what that meant. She closed the door, gently, like she was afraid of breaking something that was already broken. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I waited for the hearing. It turned out my mother hadn't been speaking in riddles for effect. There truly was a hearing, a custody and inheritance dispute, tangled up in a trust that had been quietly reactivated after 11 years of dormancy. My mother had been named as a potential witness because, as it turned out, she had once worked alongside Aliner's family, decades ago, before any of us were born into this story. Before Daniel. Before me. I begged Daniel to tell me everything he knew, and slowly, painfully, in the middle of the night when neither of us could sleep, he did. Her name was Josephine, he said, staring at the ceiling of his childhood bedroom where he'd been staying since the wedding. My mother's younger sister, my aunt. I only ever knew her from photographs. But she's your mother's sister, I said. Not some stranger. Why would anyone fake a death for? I don't know, Marin. I was 17 when they told me she died. Car accident, they said. No open casket. I never questioned it. Why would I? You don't question when someone tells you your aunt is gone. I thought of Aliner's face at the reception. The wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. The word dead used like a shield, over and over, like if she said it enough times it would stay true. Your mother knew, I said quietly. She knew Josephine was alive. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have to. The morning of the hearing, I dressed in gray. Not because I planned it that way, but because gray was the only color that felt honest. My mother sat 2 rows behind me in that Millbrook courtroom, refusing to meet my eyes, and Aliner sat rigid beside Daniel's father, her hands folded so tightly in her lap I thought her knuckles might crack straight through the skin. And then the side door opened. I don't know what I expected. Some version of a ghost, maybe pale, thin, unreal. What walked in instead was a woman in her late 50s, steady on her feet, wearing a plain gray suit that made her look like exactly what she was. Someone who had spent 11 years disappearing on purpose. She had Aliner's eyes. That was the first thing I noticed. The same soft brown, the same slight downward tilt at the corners that made even her neutral expression look like sorrow. Josephine Marsh, the bailiff called, and the whole room seemed to inhale at once. She sat in the witness chair, and when the attorney asked her to state, for the record, whether she had been declared deceased 11 years prior, she said simply, "Yes, I asked my sister to do it." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. The judge called for order. My mother, behind me, made a small sound I'd never heard her make before, something between a gasp and a sob, swallowed halfway down. "You asked her to," the attorney pressed. "I was married to a man who was going to kill me," Josephine said, and her voice didn't waver, not once, though I saw her hands grip the edge of the witness stand hard enough to whiten. Not someday, soon. I had already gone to the police twice. They couldn't help me the way I needed. So my sister and I made a choice. We staged an accident. I disappeared. I changed my name, moved 4 states away, and I stayed gone for 11 years so that a man who had already put me in the hospital twice would stop looking for someone who no longer existed. The room was silent enough that I could hear my own heartbeat. "And my mother," I said aloud before I could stop myself, earning a sharp look from the judge. "How does my mother fit into this?" Josephine turned, found my face in the crowd, and something in her expression softened, like she'd been waiting for this exact question. "Ruth was my closest friend," she said. "We worked together at the county records office back before any of you were born. She was the one who helped me file the paperwork. She forged nothing. She simply knew which forms wouldn't be double-checked, which clerks wouldn't ask questions. She risked her own career to help me disappear. And when I left, she was the only person outside my sister who knew I was still alive. She has carried that secret, silently, for 11 years, terrified every single day that it would come apart and ruin her family, ruin the people she loved." I turned around in my seat. My mother was crying, really crying, the kind of crying that strips a person down to something younger and more frightened than the version you grew up with. "I didn't know how to tell you," she said. so quietly only I could hear it, that I'd lied to protect a friend, and that the lie would end up standing in the middle of my own daughter's wedding. When I saw her outside that courthouse 3 weeks before your wedding alive, after 11 years, I panicked. I thought if this secret was finally surfacing, you deserved to know before you married into a family built on top of it. I didn't do it right. God, Maren, I know I didn't do it right. But I was trying to protect you from finding out some other way, some worse way. I sat there, in that gray courtroom, and felt 11 years of other people's fear rearrange everything I thought I understood about my own family. The hearing took another 2 hours. Custody of a modest trust that Josephine's abusive husband, long since divorced from her in absentia, long since remarried, and, as it turned out, recently deceased himself, had tried to keep frozen in her name to control her even from a distance. Legal questions about fraud versus survival, about paperwork versus safety. In the end, the judge ruled what any reasonable person watching would have hoped, that a woman fleeing for her life did not commit a crime by staying alive quietly. The trust was released to her. The old case, dead as the identity she'd shed, was finally closed for good. But it was what happened outside the courthouse that mattered more to me than anything said inside it. My mother found me on the steps, the autumn wind pulling at both our coats, and for the first time since I could remember, she didn't try to fix her face into something composed. "I should have told you the truth years ago," she said. "Not the day of your wedding, not like that. I have spent so many years thinking that protecting people meant staying silent, and I only just now understand how much silence can cost." "You slapped me," I said, and my voice broke on it, all the hurt of that day rushing back at once. "In front of everyone." "I know." Her chin trembled. "I panicked, Maren. I saw her alive, and every fear I'd buried for 11 years came roaring back at once, and I didn't know how to hold it. I am not proud of what I did. I will spend the rest of my life sorry for it." Daniel found me a moment later, Alina a few steps behind him, her eyes red-rimmed but steady, like she too had finally set something down she'd been carrying too long. "I'm sorry," Alina said to me. "I should have trusted you both with the truth before you ever walked down that aisle. I was so afraid of losing her again, even just the story of her, that I let the lie outlive its purpose." I looked at Josephine, standing a little apart from all of us, still getting used to being seen. Still getting used to being alive, in the open, after 11 years of living like a held breath. "Thank you," I told her, "for staying alive, even if it cost us all this." She smiled, small and tired. "Some secrets," she said, "are worth the wreckage they leave behind. I hope this one in the end is." It took months for my marriage to feel steady again. Trust, once cracked, doesn't mend on its own timeline, no matter how much you want it to. Daniel and I went to counseling. We talked, really talked, more in those months than we had in the 2 years we'd dated. My mother and I rebuilt something slower, gentler, built less on the assumption of understanding and more on the practice of asking. But every year now, on our anniversary, Josephine sends us a card. No return address, still a little bit of old habit left in her, I think. Just a single line, written in careful handwriting. Grateful to still be here, telling my own story. And every year, I read it, and I think about that morning in front of the mirror at St. Agnes Church, when I felt something in the air I couldn't name. It wasn't a warning about my marriage. It was the sound of 11 years of silence, finally, getting ready to speak.